Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is April 10th, 2019. Tonight, the Alberta election tightens as the focus shifts to the big picture. In Alberta, April 16th is drawing near at the same rate the incumbent NDP of Rachel Notley cuts into the polling lead of the UCP and Jason Kenney, and that is by the day. It's amazing what facts are capable of doing to public opinion. It's the last episode of View Up Here before the Alberta election, and we got three parts tonight. Effort to gather viewpoints and bring some needed perspective to some issues that are primary to all Albertans, beyond the partisan foolishness. And since corporate media seems to be busy, first, the second half of the UCP election platform, prior to any midnight editing, to expose a few more of the hidden gems within it, from the Harper rerun crime measures to the attempts to disguise cuts to and privatization of government services. Common theme being so many issues raised publicly aren't even mentioned in the platform. Ooh, look, SQUIRREL! Second, an interview with David Clemenhaga, award-winning journalist, author, post-secondary instructor, poet, and Alberta politics blogger. He's the proprietor, editor, writer of albertapolitics.ca, which has been informing readers since 2007. We discussed the campaign, the issues, the risks, the lame debate, and even the odd theory or two. Third, an interview with Sandra Azokar, a lifelong advocate for a fair and equal society, former child protection worker, former vice president of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, and since 2012, Executive Director of Friends of Medicare, friendsofmedicare.org, established in 1979 to protect and enhance public delivery of healthcare. We talked about the state of healthcare workers, home care, the logic of pharmacare, and the seeming lack of mention during this campaign of the single largest expense in every government budget: health services. All right, I'm going to do my damnedest to keep it within the 2 hours tonight. We've got a little more than an hour in the interviews, so I got to get to it. Now, just for reference, I quit last week because there was just too much to go through on this platform. I'm starting today on anybody who's following along at home, page 65. Cracking down on crime. Now, remember, this is a United Conservative Party document. That should give you a little initial shock removal. The first duty of government is to protect public safety. On that score, this NDP government has failed. Crime has risen steeply since the NDP took over with its soft-on-crime approach. A UCP government will act to give our police and prosecutors the tools and resources they need to protect law-abiding Albertans and put serious criminals behind bars. Now, I'm not going to go through all the points they have all the time, just the ones that, stand out. Now, UCP government will spend $10 million to hire 50 new prosecutors and support staff. Enact the Public's Right to Know Act, which will require annual reporting by judicial district on a wide number of measurements, such as number of crimes committed by persons on bail, on probation, on parole, subject to a deportation order, or previously removed for criminality. So, not about who got off, what was done that makes sense, just how many people we putting away. Conduct an immediate review of the current model of victim service delivery, victim assistance funding, and victim compensation to ensure there is necessary assistance to victims of crime. Sound familiar? It should. That's exactly what Harper said, and that law has now been tossed because of being unconstitutional, especially the victims' surtax, which judges had no alternative on applying. Yes, it was found unconstitutional. Surprise, surprise. Where's Kenney want to go? Right back down the same road. Direct a review of the Crown Policy Manual to ensure that appropriate consideration is given to whether the use of force defense in sections 34 and 35 of the Criminal Code should preclude prosecution against victims of crime with consideration of such factors as the awareness of the person of a significant delay or non-response of police to the request for assistance due to the remote location of the crime being committed, the failure of the offender to depart the premises when confronted, which, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, shall be viewed as threatening. So that's subjective now. The number of persons committing the crime and the perception of their intoxication by alcohol or drugs. Perception. Review current criminal code sentencing principles to ensure and recommend that in rural crime offenses, specific facts be considered by a sentencing court as aggravating factors, and that the principles of deterrence and denunciation be prioritized. So, sound like the Stanley case in Saskatchewan at all? These are stand your ground laws, is what these are. Spreading like wildfire across the United States. Oh, boy. So we can see where this is going. Stand your ground laws in Alberta. Special instructions for sentencing regarding who's who on each side. Now, there's a quote in their platform from Rick Hansen, former Calgary police chief. The rise in crime across Alberta in recent years has been challenging for Albertans, including law enforcement officials trying to respond. The plan put forward by Jason Kenney and the UCP will have a meaningful impact in addressing these challenges. The significant investment in prosecutors and front lines will be a direct investment in our communities and will make a difference where it matters most. This is a comprehensive plan to address crime that will produce results. Okay. Now we turn to an article that was on Livewire Calgary. It talks about Kenney announcing the hiring 50 prosecutors. What it doesn't say in the platform is he would also throw out what is currently known as the triage policy. UCP leader Jason Kenney says if he were premier, he would throw out an NDP policy that directs Alberta's Crown prosecutors to abandon some criminal cases to make sure more serious ones get to court. Kenney says the policy flies in the face of justice and could be rectified with more resources and better planning. The NDP seems to be able to find money for all sorts of things to waste it on, but they are telling prosecutors to drop criminal cases that are less important because they can't afford to deal with them. It basically means letting criminals go scot-free. Well, 2 years ago, Justice Minister Kathleen Ganley gave triage guidelines to prosecutors because some serious cases were being tossed out for taking too long to get to trial. Ganley's memo urged prosecutors to consider plea deals or to abandon some minor charges or protracted white-collar crime prosecutions to make sure serious crimes didn't fall through the cracks. Ganley responded to Kenney in a statement. She noted that her office had to act quickly in 2017 because of a Supreme Court ruling known as the Jordan decision. As listeners know, it directed that cases be tossed out if they dragged on for more than 18 months in the lower courts and 30 months in superior courts. The Jordan decision represented a marked change in the law. When someone is caught shoplifting nail polish, jail time is not always the best solution. The triage protocol goes a long way to ensuring our criminal justice system is focused on serious and violent matters. Ganley also said that Kenney and the UCP have voted against funding for dozens of Crown prosecutors, more provincial court judges, and more RCMP officers. Since 2015, this government has added more than 50 Crown prosecutors across Alberta, and in each instance, the opposition has voted against it. So he wants to basically do exactly what the NDP is doing and throw in stand your ground laws because apparently they're not doing anything. I guess if you don't vote for something and it happens, it's not happening. I don't know. Another bit of a paradox for Mr. Kenney and the UCP, protecting vulnerable Albertans. This is looking at human trafficking, apparently now. You know, the former temporary foreign worker minister, now really wound up about human trafficking. A UCP government will launch a 9-point Alberta action plan to combat human trafficking, including adoption by the legislature of the 2002 protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. This is known as the Palermo Protocol. Followed by an effort to have other provinces and the federal government adopt the same standard definitions to create a common understanding across Canada of what constitutes human trafficking. Well, that sounds very noble, doesn't it? Now, for what's not in here, Canada signed the Palermo Protocol in the year 2000. Canada ratified the Palermo Protocol in 2002. That means it's happening. But, the province didn't do it, so we're going to do that because, we like redundancy. Ensuring appropriate training for judges, prosecutors, and first responders, including police officers, nurses, and doctors, to enhance detection of human trafficking and the prosecution of human traffickers, as well as improving support for victims. Well, under this NDP government, that's happening. Ensuring that the Department of Labour provides information to temporary foreign workers in Alberta about their rights under Canadian law, assuring them that if they report an instance of human trafficking, they will not be subject to removal for the duration of their work permit. That's happening now. Something else that's very free market, shall we say, we'll find this through their platform in a lot of things, establish a tort of human trafficking so that victims may bring a civil action against traffickers who are or have preyed on them and sue for damages. Well, currently the way it works is, especially temporary foreign workers that are trafficked, that are abused, when their cases are brought to light, basically their only recourse right now is to sue the government because the government approved the applications and the whoever asked for the temporary foreign workers. but this would remove the government from responsibility. So is that going to help screening and background checks on people who want to bring over temporary foreign workers? Unlikely. Does it help solve the problem? No. Lobby the federal government to strengthen penalties against human traffickers by bringing into force Bill C-452, which amends the criminal code to impose consecutive sentences for trafficking in persons. Again, we're back to the old Harper, more time is good time. Now, the platform mentions that C-452 needs to be brought into force. That is correct. It has not received royal assent, but it's made it through both houses. Now, the Liberals in Ottawa currently have Bill C-38, which is about exploitation and trafficking in persons. I turn to the constitutional overview of that bill, as every bill now gets. The Minister of Justice has examined Bill C-38 for compliance with the Charter pursuant to the Minister of Justice's obligation under Section 4.1 of the Department of Justice Act. Get right to it. Former Bill C-452, an act to amend the criminal code regarding exploitation and trafficking in persons, received royal assent in June 2015, but is yet to be proclaimed in force. Bill C-452 would amend the criminal code by enacting Section 279.05. This provision would require the imposition of consecutive sentences for human trafficking offenses and other related offenses arising out of the same events, many of which are punishable by mandatory minimum sentences. Most human trafficking offenses carry mandatory minimums ranging from 1 to 6 years. Because mandatory minimums have the potential to unjustifiably limit Section 12 Charter protection against cruel and unusual punishment or treatment, and the addition of a consecutive sentence requirement increases this concern. Bill C-38 would bring into force all of former Bill C-452 except for its mandatory consecutive sentencing provision. Well, that's exactly the one thing that Kenney wants to see, and it's the one thing based on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms the government will not enact. Why? Courts would be obliged to impose such sentences consecutively without regard to an offender's specific circumstances, which could lead to grossly disproportionate sentences. That, by definition, is one that is so excessive as to outrage standards of decency and abhorrent or intolerable to society. Such an outcome could limit the right against cruel and unusual punishment that is protected by Section 12 of the Charter. And then, of course, because, this is a Liberal government, not bringing Section 279.05 into force is consistent with the government's commitment to respect and uphold the Charter. Well, yeah, we already know that. CPC and Harper and that crowd, they don't really give a shit about that. Now, in addition, to protect minority communities that are largely targeted by hate-inspired violence and vandalism, a UCP government will establish the Security Infrastructure Program, which will be modeled after a similar program Jason Kenney helped establish at the federal level. Oh boy. Religious and ethno-cultural groups at risk of being victimized by hate-motivated crime will be eligible for matching grants of up to $100,000 for the purchase of alarm systems, fences, gates, lighting, security film for windows, closed-circuit television systems, exterior cameras, anti-graffiti sealant, and motion detectors. A matching grant. anytime we saw matching grants from the Harper government, they had to approve the vendor. Keep that in mind. Now, when they talk about, this target of vandalism, there's not one mention of the far right. What this would actually do, in my opinion, in the end, is the public would subsidize the costs of white nationalist vandalism. Wonderful. How are we doing for time? We'll see. The next section, harnessing the power of civil society. This is Thatcherism. This is neoliberalism. This is the big society. Now, you tell me if this makes sense to you. One of the first principles of conservatism is that civil society should come before government, and that voluntary groups are generally more effective in preventing and reducing social problems than a big bureaucratic state. Sadly, all too often, the state gets in the way of simple efforts by community groups to help those in need. A UCP government will help expand civil society efforts by adopting a Freedom to Care Act that allows for charitable and nonprofit groups to apply for a common sense exemption from regulations that are designed primarily for commercial application, where those regulations have the unintended consequence of preventing a social good from being performed. That's also a transfer of responsibility. You think back to stuff like the federal funding, where groups had to agree that they were not publicly against abortion. This is what this common sense exemption means to me. Create a Premier's Charities Council to advise the government on how best to assist the efforts of civil society groups. What groups? Wilberforce? Campaign Life Coalition? Right Now? Create a weekly Points of Light Award to recognize outstanding groups or individuals who exemplify Alberta's spirit of volunteerism. Yeah, I bet the first winner will be John Carpe. This is propaganda. And this is picking winners and losers. I thought that was the last thing government should do. Create a $20 million civil society fund supported by the Alberta Lotteries Fund to support innovative cost-shared programs delivered by community groups. So, we're going to take lottery money, subsidize who knows who. Again, I mentioned Wilberforce, Campaign Life, and it removes a direct connection between those groups and the government because now the lottery fund is handing it out. Very sneaky. Wherever possible, partner with civil society organizations to deliver government programming and services where they can achieve results more efficiently and effectively. Well, that's a flat-out subsidy, and it's also a long-term funding pipeline. Just imagine. This is no stretch. Wilberforce is approved. They're on the list. They're good. Oh, well, you can deliver some government services, then we have a contract, you have steady funding, and everything's cool because you have a common sense exemption. What bullshit. And then they come right out and say it. Ensure that faith-based charities and nonprofits have equal access to government grants and contributions. Is it going to be against the charter? Count on it. Doesn't matter. Reduce the bureaucratic burdens, such as renewal obligations for proven civil society groups that deliver results for Albertans, including moving to 5-year funding agreements, if and where possible. So reduced oversight and make funding agreements that go beyond your government mandate. Another Harper trick. Oi. making life better for seniors and their families. A UCP government will prioritize capital funding for the immediate creation of new long-term care beds to community, nonprofit, and independent providers. Return to using the Affordable Supportive Living Initiative partnerships to ensure more units are built more quickly and cost effectively. ASLI was something that was stopped by the New Democratic government because it's a fancy name for P3s. Plain and simple. They pledged to maintain all seniors' benefits. Well, considering probably 95% of seniors' benefits come from Ottawa, good job. A Heroes Fund and Veterans Scholarships. The only reason I'm really bringing this up, because it's small money and it's just a PR play. But one of the biggest lies that they have just refused to acknowledge and take out of this rag is on this page. And they've been using this for months, and everybody said it was a lie, and they still put it in a platform, and they don't care. And nobody asks about it anymore. You know, see how this works? A UCP government will create the $1 million Alex Descoteaux Veterans Scholarship of Honor. Alex Descoteaux, Canada's first Aboriginal police officer, joined the Edmonton Police in 1909. He was an accomplished competitive runner who represented Canada at the 1916 Olympic Games. There were no 1916 Olympic Games. There was this thing going on called World War I. He went on to enlist in the Canadian Expeditionary Force prior to 1916 and was killed by a sniper's bullet on October 30th, 1917, during the Battle of Passchendaele. This is how they take an Indigenous person and use them in their platform. They lie, and they don't care. A lot of respect. Now, as far as municipalities go, a little bit interesting. As far as everybody worrying about the drastic spending cuts to come, the UCP government will maintain key infrastructure commitments in the province's capital plan. Amend the Municipal Governance Act to allow municipalities to offer property tax incentives to attract investment and development. They will let Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, Red Deer, Fort McMurray give deals for development on their property tax rates. And what do property taxes mostly pay for? Public education. Cut provincial regulation and paperwork for Alberta cities and allow municipalities to pass on those savings to taxpayers. So now we're trying to push the trickle-down dream between levels of government? Holy shit. Amend the Gaming, Liquor, and Cannabis Act to give municipalities more flexibility to permit responsible adults to drink alcohol in parks, street festivals, or other areas, and begin with relaxing liquor constraints in a number of provincial parks. So take it back to how it was in the 90s with Klein, when so many people were out of work and you could drink in the parks. Yeah, that's when we used to have riots on long weekends in provincial parks. Yeah, for sure. Let's do that. Immediately relax Alberta Gaming Liquor Commission regulations that require enclosed events like folk festivals to keep those having a drink within unreasonably narrow zones. Well, first of all, they're not unreasonably narrow zones. There's an unreasonable amount of people that want to fucking drink. So what we've heard out of Ontario in the last week with Ford, exact same thing. Now, what will this bring us? Especially at public events like folk festivals, if drunks can wander around anywhere with a drink, more police, more problems, which means more cost for the event, and your tickets go up. Yeah, awesome. Making housing affordable and accessible for Albertans. Repurpose some of the capital funding for new and refurbished affordable housing projects into public-private partnerships, where we can be assured of getting more housing per tax dollar. Well, we know that P3s are cheaper for a government to put on the books year to year. Thing is, they never disappear from the books. That's why they stopped it. Even the Progressive Conservatives, before the NDP, had decided that one round of P3 public schools was enough because it was a complete rip-off. But, according to Kenney, let's bring them back. He goes on to mention restarting ASLI, which is P3s. Here's something that's really ridiculous when you think about it. It sounds good if you're still in this fantasy land that you're a young family and, if we could afford another $100 a month, let's buy a home. UCP government will seek an exemption from the Canada Home and Mortgage Corporation stress tests. And they will encourage provincially regulated financial institutions, such as credit unions, who do not play with CMHC, to return to the old underwriting standards, which are more appropriate for Alberta's housing market. What does that mean, more appropriate? Alberta already has the highest consumer debt levels in all of Canada. So let's take away a stress test that was developed by CMHC to see who really can handle a mortgage. Does 2008 sound familiar to anybody? Kenney wants to use government to weaken the housing finance stability because people make lots of money then. Guess who? Not the people buying the goddamn houses. Making life better for Alberta's Indigenous peoples. A UCP government will support legal action for pro-resource groups in Indigenous communities with a $10 million fund. Include Alberta's Indigenous communities in our Stand Up for Alberta strategy to help energy projects and Indigenous communities both succeed and prosper. Notice here they will include Indigenous communities into their strategy. They won't support Indigenous communities having their own strategy. Assimilate. You want money? Assimilate. Advocate for a federal Aboriginal consultation process that provides clear timelines and legal certainty for project proponents, consistent with the federal government's constitutional obligations. What? More gobbledygook. Work with the federal government to streamline how Indigenous people access key services such as education and healthcare, including ensuring Indigenous students have access to a provincial education system paid for with federal dollars. Yeah, of course. They want to butt in and take federal money to educate First Nation students in public schooling. Meanwhile, anything you hear about a First Nation that's serious about maintaining their culture and their language demands that they establish their own educational system. So now Kenney is basically saying to Ottawa, you want to give that money to them or do you want to give it to me? As far as the environment goes, pretty much what you would expect. There is one new thing, though. Apply a mandatory $30 trail permit fee to off-highway vehicles and camping trailers to pay for restoring and creating off-highway vehicle trails and preventing damage in Alberta's great outdoors, and to hire additional fish cops. So I'm surprised that's basically their demographic. I'm surprised. I've never heard this mentioned publicly from anybody in the party, but it's in the platform. Review Alberta environment and parks legislation to modernize it for the 21st century. Yeah, that means deregulate. Ensure that in the future, all major environmental protection proposals will be subject to the mandatory social economic impact assessments to allow the government to strike the appropriate balance between economic growth and environmental protection. You know what that's called? It's called the National Energy Board. That's why the NEB is a useless piece of shit. Proponents can table, we're going to pay $300 billion in taxes. NEB says, oh, cool, thanks. We'll put that in the records. We'll definitely consider that. That's what he wants to set up. And if Bill C-69 ever becomes law, the NEB is dead, and he has a mirror here in Alberta to cause problems. Encourage and increase the use of development credits and conservation offsets in provincial development policy. Let's translate that. Let's say a Kenney government sells a shitload of Crown land in the middle of nowhere, likely forested, and some oil company buys it. There's no bitumen under it. They just buy it. Then they want to do some damage somewhere. Well, they can trade off with these trees in the middle of fucking nowhere that nobody's ever going to be there. That's their insurance policy. There is your conservation offset. Garbage. Okay, I wanted to get to this. Democratic reforms. Albertans sent a message in the last provincial election. They wanted more accountability and to clean up our politics, including getting big money out of the system. Instead, we ended up with an NDP government that has brought the biggest money ever into Alberta politics, the public treasury, and used it to campaign well into the fixed election period. They have betrayed voters' trust with floor crossings, lowered decorum in the legislature, and forced their MLAs to follow the party line on anything. And keep in mind, this is coming from a guy who was in Harper's cabinet for a decade. Floor crossings? In Alberta, you want to talk about floor crossings. Danielle Smith, Jim Prentice, ring a bell? But oh no, it's all about Sandra Jensen. Bullshit. Force their MLAs to follow the party line? Someone who is in the Harper government? Oh. Okay, what do they want to do? Introduce a recall act based on precedents in several jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom, United States, and in British Columbia. Yeah, whatever. Whoop-de-doo. Propaganda. Establish a specific fixed election date. To what end? It's stupid. No reasonable government in the world would do that. You imagine the fuckery that invites when everybody knows? Allow free votes for MLAs on everything, not deemed a confidence vote or a key platform commitment. Well, define key platform commitment. Every day the whip could say, well, it's none of them are key platform commitments. Today, everybody vote the line. They're ridiculous. We've been hearing this for 50 years from all parties. Free vote, free vote. Bullshit. Your parties. That's how it works. I like this one. Stop floor crossing by requiring that MLAs resign and seek a by-election before they can join the UCP caucus. So only people would want to cross to your party. And you make them run in a by-election to earn it. Or you drop somebody in against them if you don't like them anyway, and you punish them for wanting to change party. That's not how the system works, man. Besides, what are you going to do about the people who step down from your caucus? Because I'm sure there'll be more of them than the other way around. Renew the Senatorial Selection Act and hold elections for senatorial nominees in 2021. Waste of money. Nothing else. Amend the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act to require a referendum before any carbon tax can be introduced in the future. Yeah, besides being unconstitutional, it's just stupid. Introduce the End Partisan Government Advertising Act, making it illegal for governments to advertise in the run-up to an election and to use tax dollars for partisan ads at any time. Is that right? All righty. Let's go back to 2013 during the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I'm going to go from an article from January of 2014 when the numbers had come in. CBC, Sophia Harris, millions spent on federal ads for non-existent jobs grants. The federal government blanketed the internet with ads and bought pricey TV spots during playoff hockey, part of a $2.5 million publicity blitz to promote a skills training program that doesn't yet exist. TV commercials for the Canada Job Grant often ran twice per game in May 2013 during the widely watched Hockey Night in Canada playoff broadcasts on CBC. There were ads on radio as well. The Canada Job Grant will result in one important thing, a new or better job, said the reassuring voiceover in the TV ads. The problem is the program was never launched and is still on hold. Job grants were announced in the 2013 federal budget, but it called for an agreement with the provinces, which have so far refused to buy in. Employment and Social Development Canada spent between $2.5 and $2.6 million on the campaign. That figure excludes radio ads funded by the Finance Department. And who was the Minister of Employment and Social Development at this time? Jason Kenney. CBC learned that the advertising cash came from an $11 million fund set aside last year for Employment and Social Development Canada to promote the government as a job creator. How many times do we hear conservatives say the government's not in the business of creating jobs? Before the TV ad went to air, the government paid Environics Research Group almost $70,000 to conduct market research. Holy Christ. A government commission survey done post-campaign showed only 2% of the 292 people polled who saw or heard the ad also caught the disclaimer that the program didn't yet exist. It also found only 18% of viewers understood tax dollars paid for the advertising. So Advertising Standards Canada did an investigation. They said that the commercials omitted relevant information. Oh, my God. So Kenny's talking about the Notley government burning taxpayer dollars on partisan advertising. Well, he set up an $11 million fund to do just that. His ministry. Okay, how much we got here? Damn it. Okay, I'm not going to bother with that. Standing up to foreign influences. This is wonderful shit. We will stand up to well-funded foreign special interests who have been waging a decade-long campaign to landlock Alberta's oil and gas with their campaign of defamation. And who is the source that he bases this premise on? British Columbia journalist Vivian Krause. So that's it. That's all I got to say on that. Gross. Whatever. The foreign interference in Alberta and Canada has been deep and pervasive. Here's more just outstanding reference. In 2017, journalist Licia Corbella showed how Lead Now, funded by the Tides Foundation, took an active role in the 2015 federal election, specifically targeting conservative candidates. Lead Now staff members flew around the country, as Facebook postings and photographs show, to distribute flyers and put up signs. Organizers posted their results online to take credit for their ability to influence the election. On the face of it, that's true. I was involved in that, and I'll tell you what Lead Now did. They flew around to connect people. They did not fly around to dictate strategy. Every targeted riding in that Lead Now campaign, the people who turned up decided what their priorities were themselves. There was no national direction. George Soros didn't fucking show up. Whatever. This was far from the first election influenced by Tides and Tides-funded organizations. Yet, despite the fact that Tides openly advertises to recruit employees for electoral activism, the Canada Revenue Agency has not taken a serious look at revoking Tide Canada's status as a registered charity. Like the Fraser Institute. A UCP government will establish an energy war room to respond in real time to the lies and myths told about Alberta's energy industry through paid, earned, and social media. The Energy War Room will be a part of the Communications and Public Engagement Office with a $30 million budget. $20 million will come from carbon charges on large emitters. A UCP government will use the persuasive power of the Premier's bully pulpit to tell the truth in both official languages across Canada and around the world about how Albertans produce energy with the world's highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards. Well, no, they don't. Ever heard of fucking Norway? Now, going back to the Energy War Room for a minute, you know what this sounds like exactly? Exactly what the Israeli army does. Exact same thing. That's a nice thought. Create a $10 million litigation fund to support pro-development First Nations. Yeah, we went through that. Ask for the energy industry to significantly increase its advocacy efforts. What, lie louder? Seek out and support Alberta energy companies that are willing to challenge the campaign of defamation by anti-Alberta special interests, similar to Resolute Forest Products' defamation suit against Greenpeace for $300 million in damages. What they failed to put into the platform is that lawsuit was thrown out of court. Oh, my goodness. Launch a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act into the foreign sources of funds behind the anti-Alberta energy campaign. The inquiry will have the power to compel witness testimony and have a $2.5 million budget. The inquiry may follow up on investigations done in other jurisdictions that have confirmed foreign government meddling to prevent oil and gas development in North America. So, is he going to go off some bullshit that comes out of North Dakota or Oklahoma or Texas? Talk about witch hunt. There it is. Now, why am I missing something here? Well, no, I'm not. Okay. Damn it. I got to get this in, the last part. Now, as far as this banning foreign money stuff, I forgot to read a line here somewhere. There it is. Actively support and seek adoption of Senator Linda Frum Bill S-239, which would ban foreign money in federal Canadian politics. Well, another senator spoke out against that bill in debate in the Senate, Senator Yuen Pa Wu from BC. People say nothing good ever happens in the Senate. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit of his statement. First, let's be honest and recognize that our version of democracy is imperfect, as are all versions of democracy, and that although we must try to improve how we give a voice to Canadians by developing the laws that affect them, there is no magic solution that addresses the many deficits of our electoral system. In the context of the multiple deficits in our democracy, the problem of foreign funding in Canadian elections is, in my view, a lesser problem. Now, it is the kind of problem that inflames Canadians because we hate to think that foreigners might be influencing our elections. I think we should be much more outraged by the fact that about 40% of eligible voters don't or can't exercise their franchise, and that some votes, in effect, count for less than others because of where the voter happens to live. When it comes to issues that involve us, Canadians, and them, foreigners, there's a tendency to create simple dualities of right and wrong, when in fact there should be much more shading in our understanding. In thinking about foreign influence on one's political views, where do you draw the line? Do you read the Wall Street Journal, Nikkei Keizai Shimbun, The Guardian, or Le Figaro? What subversive foreign ideas have you picked up from these publications, which are widely available in our country? Colleagues, are mistruths by a country's nationals less harmful than mistruths by foreign nationals? Can you imagine a situation where foreign nationals may be conveying truthful information to counter untruths propagated by sources within the country? In our zeal to defend the right to make decisions ourselves, let's not go down the road of parochialism that privileges nationality or place of residence over reason. Indeed, foreign interests have already made significant investments in some of our major newspapers and are probably among the most influential opinion makers in an election. Bill S-239 does not change anything in that regard. Moreover, we have not talked at all about social media yet, a huge, noisy, unregulated, and largely anonymous world that spreads information that can be designed, or not, to influence the outcome of Canadian elections. Depending on your point of view, these examples are the equivalent of water dripping into the house from the ceiling. That is to say, negative foreign influences are still entering our country, or not being able to flush your toilet because the water mains have been blocked. In other words, positive foreign influences have been stopped. The unintended consequences of Bill S-239, on the other hand, have to do with potentially hundreds of public policy advocacy organizations and charities that could be seen to be in violation of the Act because they accepted donations from foreign sources at any time, let alone in the 6-month period before an election. This loophole creates the potential for politically motivated mischief on the part of partisans who seek to stymie legitimate public policy advocacy on the false grounds of foreign influence. It is not just that this bill inconveniences some organizations whose work touches on public policy. It is also that the bill may be in violation of your rights. When prohibitions on free speech are overly broad, such restrictions on speech that may be aligned with a political platform during an election campaign, and for which foreign funding may have played a role, fundamental rights are trampled on. Well, I'm pounding my table for the senator. Coming from Linda Fromm, what do you expect? All right, I got that in at the deadline. Now, David Kleiman-Haga is an award-winning journalist, author, post-secondary teacher, poet, and wow, I just lost my spot here. Sorry. Well, he is the sorry, David. He is a proprietor, editor, writer for AlbertaPolitics.ca. Been around since 2007. We sat down for an interview. Like I said in the opening, campaign issues, risks, the lame debate, and the odd theory or two. Here's David. The View Up Here is proud to welcome Mr. David Clemenhaga to the show. David, of course, being the proprietor, editor, writer for albertapolitics.ca. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much.
Now, of course, you hear how every election is the most critical of our generation. But do you think that there's actually some truth to it this time in Alberta?
I think it's a pretty important election in terms of the potential damage that could come from a Kenney government. But I also think that politics is a long-term process, it's a bit, as you were implying, it's a bit like car manufacturers who are always telling you that their latest model is the greatest and latest thing. Well, you know what? Should the NDP lose this election, there will be future elections. So, but Mr. Kenney is a dangerous politician. I think that he's a real market fundamentalist, and I think that he's a sincere social conservative. And on both fronts, he's probably out of tune with what Albertans really want in a social sense. But in the short term, the reality of politics is that if you govern during a time when the economy is not as strong as it was before, you own that, whether or not it's your fault. So Dwayne Bratt said this morning in a tweet, and I agreed with this, is that the chances are that the pipeline to the west coast, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, will be completed on Kenney's watch, and he will take entire credit for it and get entire credit for it, even though it will only be there because of the policies that were pursued by Ms. Notley and by Justin Trudeau. That's, no one said life is fair, and that's probably the only point I agree with conservative politicians on.
Indeed, life is not fair, and political life is definitely not fair. But as you said, framing the current conditions to claim them as your well-doing. We saw the Alberta debate last night, and as we discussed before we started recording, I thought it had the potential to be the Super Bowl of the campaign, but it was far less than that. There was no defining moment like we saw in 2015 with Math is Hard or anything along those lines. Do you get the feeling that it was engineered to be more pedestrian than it possibly could? I mean, you put out a column today about your reflections on the debate. I agree with a lot of it. Something you mentioned a lot was the neutrality of a lot of the questions. I thought with the journalists that they had on the panel, this should be probative, but it wasn't really. And then the moderator, Tara Nelson from CTV Calgary, seemed to be preventing some real exchanges. Do you find...
I agree with that, but I don't know that I would assign it to a conspiracy. And I say, never, you know what they say, never credit malice what incompetence will explain. And so, I do, seriously, I think that the problems with the format was poor. It was confusing. They kept potentially the most entertaining guy, Derek Fildebrandt, who, again, I don't agree with, but deserved to be heard from. They kept him out of the debate for reasons that don't really make logical sense. They argued that the reason was that he had, that his party hadn't run, now the so-called Freedom Conservative Party, hadn't run in the previous election. Well, you'll recall that the UCP didn't either, but they treated one as a legacy party and the other not. Anyway, I think that it was at a very weird time when a lot of people couldn't listen to it. It was when the afternoon commute was still going on. Why they would have chosen that hour. Why they chosen the candidates, allowed in the ones they did and the ones they didn't, what the real reasoning was, we don't know. You're right, the questions, there were constraints on the questioners that made their questions lame. The moderation, I thought, was terrible. I hate to be critical of someone who I'm sure was doing her best, but she was shouting over people to get them under control when they were out of control because they wanted to respond to an accusation that had been directed at them. And then this creates an additional factor. It makes both Mr. Kenney and Ms. Notley look like they're being rude to one another when really they're just trying to stand up for the point they're making. So I just thought it was a terrible format. But the thing to remember is that most televised debates, pre-election televised debates of this sort, are dull. And most of them are tightly controlled and people stay on message and the questions aren't very good. It's unusual when you get those killing moments. But when you do, you hear them over and over again. You had a choice, Mr. Chairman, you had a choice. Well, I knew JFK and you're no JFK. Those are the great moments in debates. But really we can only think of 3 or 4 of them because there probably over the years haven't been very many of that sort. So Ms. Notley had a remarkably good performance in 2015. She was lucky that she was handed a line by the person that she was, the principal person she was arguing with, and the timing was great, right? Sometimes you catch the wave and sometimes you don't. My fear is that in this election the NDP hasn't quite caught it. Things are moving in their direction a bit, but they need more time. And they're not going to get it because of when the election was called. On the other hand, there were other factors they were thinking of. Evangelical churches now are powerful forces for conservatism. God knows why, because there's nothing in the gospel of Jesus that would draw you to that conclusion. But anyway, those churches, Easter's coming up, those would have been powerful organizing opportunities for somebody like Mr. Kenney if the timing had gone after the Easter holidays. So you work with the circumstances you have, and the circumstances that you've created for yourself to some extent, and that's what they're trying to do. And they are actually doing pretty well. I think the Conservative campaign is much more concerned than it was a few weeks ago. Kenney's a clever politician, but I would say to you, don't count Ms. Notley out at this point. She's also a clever politician and a hard worker, and anything could still happen. But it depends on factors now that, to some degree, the closer you get to the date, the fewer factors are in your own control. The polling's still not great. I think the majority of it for the NDP. There's even the ones where they're moving ahead, they're not moving ahead fast enough for the time frame that remains, unless something dramatic happens. But we all know from studying history that dramatic things do happen. So they happened last time.
Yeah, I find that to be a very good point, because I remember back to the supposed miracle majority of Alison Redford. It was basically 10 days before the election. Apparently she didn't have a hope in hell. But then something big did happen, the lake of fire. Yeah, though, there are narratives. Mm-hmm. And people put forward narratives with more or less success. And I can think of examples where people tried to push a narrative that didn't really catch on. But the conservative media, and all the media in Alberta is conservative except for small volume bloggers like myself, but the conservative media in this province has really wanted an extreme right-wing market fundamentalist government. This has been particularly true of Post-Media. And they pushed Jason Kenney hard, but they also pushed Danielle Smith hard. And I don't know that Albertans were really very comfortable with Danielle Smith. I don't know that they're really very comfortable with Jason Kenney as a person. We keep hearing that Ms. Notley's popularity runs ahead of his. But, the reality is that you can only have so many lakes of fire, and people start to become inured to it. And I find that's even with people who oppose the conservative policies, is that there have been so many bozo eruptions that you're almost inclined to shrug your shoulders and say, well, what's the big deal? He won't do anything about it anyway. And so to some degree, a lot of voters are looking at what they perceive to be the bigger picture. A commenter on my blog made a very thoughtful remark. I thought he's a farmer, and he talked about people in his rural area who really have suffered a heavy loss of income because of the downturn in the oil industry. And what he was saying was that if you blame the real cause of that downturn, fracking in the United States, the big supply of cheap, high-quality gas, and as a consequence of that, and world oil prices, which are really not anything that we can set or control in Alberta, to acknowledge that that was the cause is to give up hope for people in the circumstances of his neighbors who made a lot of money working in the oil patch and also were able to run basically a hobby farm. But if you blame Rachel Notley and say, well, Jason Kenney can come in and fix it, then you have hope. You don't have to surrender yourself completely to despair. It's not going to make any difference. Jason Kenney can't control oil prices. Jason Kenney can't make coastal British Columbians think anything different. Jason Kenney can't change the fundamentals of the world oil market. All he can do is make a lot of noise. And, that works well for conservative politicians, and politicians of the left should learn from that. It was frustrating to me to watch the NDP come in and say, well, we're not going to be like those other parties. We're going to provide good government. We're going to listen to our civil servants. We're going to be thoughtful. We're going to take our time and think about issues. We're going to make decisions based on evidence. Fine, that's all good, but why wouldn't they sing about their successes? Why wouldn't they shout out about the failures of the previous government? But they never did that until really, I think, it was too late in the process. We'll see.
I mean, like I say, don't rule out Ms. Notley. She's a formidable campaigner, but...
That does make sense to me, because I think about the debate last night, and I've always had the opinion that one of the first things that the Notley government did was the most important to stop the snowball rolling down the hill for Alberta, and that's when they said flat out, we are not going to mass lay off civil servants, because where will the services come from for them? You think it's bad now, let's put another 20,000 people out of work.
Yeah, forget the civil servants. I want to talk about that. That's a good point. And the civil service is so small in Alberta because of what Ralph Klein did and what no government has built it up since, including the NDP. So the civil service is so small, we're really probably very close to minimum for the size of the province. It's healthcare workers where those big cuts came, where there could be privatization, where really serious implications, both in terms of the economy, like you say, and in terms of the quality of healthcare we can get, exists. So, I guess I would say that this is one of the real dangers of Kenney, that he'll do another wholesale assault on the healthcare system, just like Klein did, and set it back for another 20 years. And that'll have implications, Alison Pollock was just talking now at the meeting we're at, and she made the very good point that healthcare quality declines for wealthy people too when you go to a privatized system. It may not seem so, but they're actually suffering perhaps from over-medication and from over-treatment and from over-testing. So it not only costs a lot, not only wastes a lot of resources, ties up resources. The whole theory that the Conservatives shamelessly push, that if you take rich people out of the lineup for public health care, the lineup will go shorter, is wrong for the simple reason that doctors can't be in two places at once. As I said in my blog the other day, they can't even be in two places at once in an Ayn Rand novel.
Well, I mean, that is a very good sign that people maybe should pay a little more attention to where these large cuts come from public programs, because, as you said, usually those are the ones that are the most attractive targets to be dismantled, privatized, and they are essential services. Nobody can escape the need for health care. Nobody can escape the need for things like registries for your vehicle and stuff like that we saw Klein do in the past. From what Doug Ford is starting to do now in Ontario, as the numbers are starting to, quote-unquote, get leaked out about the number of teachers, the number of healthcare workers that may lose their jobs, Jason Kenney likes to talk about how him and Doug Ford are such good pals and they finish each other's sentences. Should Albertans be looking at Ontario, in your opinion, for what may come?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that what will come, if Kenney's elected, is to some degree what's happening in Ontario. He's a smarter man than Mr. Ford, so he'll probably deliver it more smoothly. But I would say to you there's a real possibility, and again, this isn't an entirely original thought on my part, but that it's Kenney's thinking that's driving Ford, not what we're seeing in Ontario that's going to drive what's in Alberta. I mean, Kenney is a significant leader of the Canadian Conservative movement. He was a senior minister in Harper's government. The destructive policies that Harper wanted to enact at the federal level, he would like to enact at the federal level too, and he's still looking to the federal level. Now, I want to raise a possibility that I heard this morning on the CBC, and again, I think I quoted him earlier, but Dwayne Bratt, the political scientist from Mount Royal University, was talking about how Mr. Kenney may not be here in Alberta long before there's a demand for him to go to Ottawa, because the federal Conservative Party has extremely weak leadership right now, as do all the other major parties in Canada. So ask yourself, is it possible that we will see another national campaign for the Prime Minister of Canada and the control of the country between Jason Kenney and Rachel Notley? This could happen because Mr. Kenney's game plan is clearly to win this election and use that as a jumping point. I think it's clear, to jump back to Ottawa. And Ms. Notley, whatever she says and whatever she thinks right now, is not going to want to stick around as a leader of the opposition after she's been premier. And so, the NDP also has an extremely weak leader who's not worked out as advertised, who if he suffers a big election setback in the federal election this fall, as desperate progressives hold their noses and vote for Mr. Trudeau even though they can't stand him, because the prospect of Mr. Scheer and that bunch of creeps in the federal Conservative Party is so much worse that the NDP is going to need a new leader too. My operating theory for years has been that Mr. Trudeau would make Rachel Notley the ambassador to Ireland to neutralize the possible danger she might present on the federal scene, but we'll see. Anyway, so I wouldn't say, nothing. Once I predicted that Gary Marr would end up leading the federal Conservatives, and that certainly didn't come true. So
Thank goodness.
I shouldn't be boasting about my wrong predictions, but anyway, I wouldn't say it's not impossible in this potential imagined future history that Canada could have, that we could have another a rematch of the Notley-Kenney election either way, regardless of who wins on April 16.
Well, that's interesting because, as my listeners know, I have floated the theory that I think it's quite possible that Jason Kenney could become Premier of Alberta, and within 8 weeks, there is suddenly a Patrick Brown moment for Mr. Scheer, and he just has to lead the federal Conservative Party.
That's an interesting thought because there has been no Canadian Premier that has become Prime Minister since Sir Charles Tupper. Right around the time of Confederation. And Sir Charles Tupper, now I'm sorry, I do not have the precise timelines in my mind, but he was Premier of Nova Scotia for a very short period of time, and he was Prime Minister of Canada for a very short period of time. And I think in the former case it was something like 3 days, but I'd have to look it up, and I'm not going to do that right now. But, one of the reasons he was able to make that jump, even at that time, because Canadians then and now distrust a provincial politician as a federal politician, because they feel rightly, I think, that here is somebody who's put their whole being into representing one region of this country, and they cannot be an effective leader of the country in that way. This was a liability. Canadian Prime Ministers have to come from somewhere in Canada, but to have been the leader of a province put them at a disadvantage in terms of being the Prime Minister, because they're viewed as potentially favoring that region. And this has been fairly consistent through an attitude of people through Canadian history. And you'll see that in Ontario, voters, for example, frequently, habitually elect, if there were two large parties in Canada, Liberals and Conservatives, would elect Liberals at home if there were Conservatives in Ottawa, and Conservatives at home if there were Liberals in Ottawa, because they wanted that balance. We continue to follow historical patterns. So I could see circumstances in which if Kenney was going to make that jump, probably the only way he could successfully do it would be to be really fast, like you say. So that's an interesting thought. We don't know, again, what's going to happen. He doesn't know what's going to happen because none of us do. An asteroid could hit the Earth and end all life on the planet. But anyway, it's an interesting thought. If he was going to make that move, that might be the way to do it.
Well, this morning here at the Public Interest Alberta conference that we're at, we heard about how Brexit has dominated the United Kingdom for 2 years, while privatization and income inequality and public services continue to deteriorate, and they seem to get no airtime, but they have lasting, far-reaching consequences. Do you think that there have been some items left out of the campaign that should have a lot more attention in Alberta, such as healthcare, such as education?
Well, sure, there are always items that are left out of campaigns, because particularly now in an area of sort of, we might call it media poverty and media deserts, right, where mainstream media that traditionally pulled the train on this stuff doesn't have the personnel to cover every story. But, and there are also other factors, and I would say to you that healthcare is a huge success story for the NDP, and the NDP has hidden its light under a bushel. They've never gone out and said, this is the first 4-year period in anyone's memory, in anyone's lifetime in Alberta, practically, back to social credit days, when we've had relative, well, really, Lougheed, I suppose, was another exception, but when we've had relative peace and good order on the healthcare front, that it has not appeared to be in chaos. Right through Getty, Klein, Alison Redford, Stelmach, the healthcare systems appeared to be in crisis. And then for 4 years it's settled down, and the NDP hasn't blown its own horn about that. So that one's not on the radar. But I find lots of flaws with the media. I find lots of fault with the media. But I don't think you can blame the media for that one not being a big story. There are lots of big issues out there that probably should have appeared in the election campaign, but issues that are close to the hearts of certain groups. In social issues, and where we are in the history of the country, and where we are in the history of humanity, and people's attitudes about things like homosexuality and women's rights to control their reproductive systems and so on. These are things that have become front and center, and then they've tended to use up all the oxygen in the debate. But, I mean, what about the issue of orphan wells?
Yes.
And the pollution left by oil companies that I guarantee you are going to try to walk away from this province when the fossil fuel market ends, which will probably be not as soon as some would like, but sooner than many of us would. And when the world changes and renewables become the norm for energy production, although that may or may not be possible in our lifetimes, but when that move starts to happen, you'll find that when global warming starts to impact coastal areas in big countries like the United States, you're going to find that things change more rapidly, that there's more pressure for change. Well, how do we deal with that? How do we manage that? I don't think that the NDP had a particularly good plan because it was too modest, but the UCP plan could be best described as old men screaming at clouds. They're going to yell at everybody and then the world will change back? I don't think so.
This thing from Kenney about the tier plan sounds to me exactly like what the federal Conservatives propose, set up a closed loop with the largest emitters, who of course are all owned by multinationals, and we'll just communicate with each other, and they'll give us some money, and then we'll give them some back, and we'll help them with research. That's not going to change a damn thing, in my opinion. It's only going to obfuscate, if there is anything going on. I find it very rich that after maybe 18 months of the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, Jason Kenney is demanding data. He wants to see results. Well, anybody who actually knows anything about it knows you can't get any cumulative data in only 18 months when you're looking to change the economy. But he gets away with it. But yet things that can be judged short term, he doesn't want to go anywhere near. I mean, I really understand what you said about there has to be a point of contention, whether anyone is responsible for it or not, because it's much easier. And as the farmer you spoke of said, reality only makes it worse. So this thing about false hope, is it too much of a factor in elections these days, or is it just a natural progression?
This is human nature. I mean, false hope has always been a factor in elections everywhere. I'm sure that the people, not that I'm comparing anyone here to this person, but I'm sure that the people who elected Adolf Hitler in the 30s would have had great hopes for what he could do for Germany. And actually, I've heard it said that on the economic front he did some things right, but the results, the potential for disaster should have been clear to a lot of people, and was clear to a lot of people. But I guess the Germans let hope overshadow practical thinking.
I agree. That is totally human nature.
I did want to say something to you about we were talking about neoliberal governments on healthcare. It was neoliberal governments will implement policies that will make the most money for their corporate patrons. So I don't know that, in a sense, the private sector really cares if there's a public healthcare system. They just don't want there to be a good public healthcare system. What they see is the opportunity to make a lot of money by offering, one way or another, offering services privately. We know from experience in Alberta that there's tremendous problems if you put your faith in private surgical companies to do surgeries. If they go broke, and things that happen routinely for a variety of reasons with corporations, then that service either can't be delivered or has to be, emergency patchworks have to be put in place at enormous cost. So what the corporate sector wants is the opportunity to make money, however that comes about, and the circumstances that foster more opportunities to make money.
I find that to be one of the little caveats that don't really get attention, because Mr. Kenney can insist that he's all in favor of a single-payer universal system. But as you just said, the corporations involved in private health care delivery don't care who pays, as long as somebody pays, right? They
may like it better if the government's paying. I mean,
it's guaranteed.
Yeah, it's guaranteed. Look at physicians. In the Depression, physicians did very poorly. Many of them were as poor as their patients. My mom used to talk about doctors being paid with a chicken because people had no money, but he could take the chicken home and slaughter it and have his wife cook it for dinner. And those were the times, right? Public health care in Canada made millionaires out of all doctors. Now some of them have the notion that, well, to hell with the other doctors, I can become a billionaire if we have a privatized system. Doctors would like to be able to double bill, to be able to say, well, I'll always have the fallback guarantee of the public system, but I'll also be able to charge richer clients more for slightly enhanced services.
Like you said, a doctor can't be in two places at once.
That's right. Well, that's why that's the problem with that's the logical fallacy about saying, well, if we take people out of the lineup, the remaining lineup will be faster. Well, no, it won't, because unless you have an unlimited supply of doctors, the doctors are also coming out of the lineup because they're doing some work elsewhere. So, and if that's where the money is, they're picking the easy cases.
Yeah.
If you're doing eye surgeries and the really complicated cases that must be done in a hospital are pushed off on the public system, then your profits go up and the public system's costs go up. There's no solution to that other than having a full public system.
Pretty much everyone, everywhere, before this writ was even dropped, said it was about Notley and Kenney. That's it. Now, last night we saw the leader of the Alberta Party, Stephen Mandel, the leader of the Alberta Liberals, David Kahn. Derek Fildebrandt was excluded. Also, another thing that not a lot of people outside of Alberta are aware of, but the number 3 party in nominations in this province is the Alberta Independence Party. And Dave Bjorkman, their leader, figured, well, I have over 60-some candidates confirmed. Why can't I get in on this debate? Do you see it as a fundamental issue with the big picture of discourse around the election, or is it, again, human nature to come down to Samson versus Goliath?
Oh, look, it's always going to be hard. I have some sympathy with the media people that organize this. If you're going to have this organized by a consortium of media or by an academic group or by the League of Women Voters, as happens in the States, you're always going to have a problem about who's in and who's out, particularly in our parliamentary system. Anybody can start a party. And so does that mean the person who started that party should automatically be in or not? It's hard to know how to draw the line. And I'm always a little bugged when the line drawing is done inconsistently, which I think happened in this case. But nevertheless, I feel some sympathy with the people trying to. You can't have every fruitcake who's founded a party. You know, they remember the Natural Law Party, which was set up as basically as an advertising gimmick for transcendental meditation. They had no serious political objectives. Well, nevertheless, they were able, out of their essentially religious group, to find candidates that could run anywhere. So do you let the leader of a party like that in the debate? Well, no. So it's hard to do. It's hard to know. It is a subjective matter, and it's always going to be. So personally, I think Fildebrandt should have been in. He's got a seat in the legislature. His party's got his seat, and he also, I was maybe biased a bit in his favor in that regard, because even though I disagree with him, he's an entertaining figure, and whenever I write something critical of him, large numbers of people come and read it.
Yes, he is colorful. There's no doubt about that. He has gotten quite a few nicknames over the years. I like to stick with Flusterbrandt, but there are others. The other thing I wanted to ask you about specifically, we've heard a lot about the United Conservative Party and groups, I'll call them, such as Campaign Life, such as the Wilberforce Project, taking great pride in having undue influence on internal matters to get their thinking candidates nominated. But yet there's so little talk about who these candidates are once they get the nomination.
Well, I think that here's a point where the mainstream media has been very irresponsible. In the Wilberforce Project in particular, which is a misnamed organization. It's named after an anti-slavery crusader. This is an anti-abortion group that really is a social conservative group that wants to restrict women's reproductive rights. And they have social goals beyond just the protection of fetuses. But regardless of that, this is a group that probably a very, very significant portion of the UCP candidates come from that group or have affiliated with that group. This is very dangerous. It will be socially divisive. I'm a father of daughters. I would be very concerned about this, and I think this is. But no one has sat down and said, "Let's figure out who of all of Kenney's candidates come from this group." No, I've never seen a list anywhere. Now, you know what? You can say, well, why don't you do it, Dave? Well, I'm one person. I'm an independent. I write a blog. I have a full-time job. I'm 67 years old. I can't do everything. The mainstream media still has significantly more resources than me. Why haven't they done this? I can't answer that question. In the case of Postmedia, I think it's because they don't want to do it, because they're openly campaigning for the UCP. But it's a very good question. Why hasn't anybody provided this essential service that we should be able in a democracy to expect during an election campaign? I think it's quite troubling. I think the numbers will actually, when we know, when somebody eventually does, perhaps after they're elected, God forbid, somebody will realize that there were a lot more of them than we thought. Mr. Kenney himself is a social conservative. Mr. Kenney himself has based his life on campaigning against abortion rights. So from the time we know this, right, from the time he was in his 20s, or now he pretends he was a teenager, but he's been active in that movement. So there's no question. They're not going to come in overnight and say we're banning abortions, but they're going to restrict abortions. They're going to add costs to them. They're not going to provide services at public hospitals. They're going to allow Catholic hospitals to opt out. They're going to make it difficult for people to provide that service. They're going to pull back funds. You know, we all know how this works. We've seen it working in the United States for 30 years now, to the point where now Alabama comes forward and brings forward a bill that says all abortion is illegal in the state, period, because they think, well, we finally got enough conservative judges in the Supreme Court that we can get this through.
Do you think there's any fault on the NDP by being so dependent, with setting up websites about truths about Jason Kenney? They are truths, but they have focused on him like a laser. Do you think that the NDP maybe should have paid a little more attention to all these candidates that may have agendas from organizations like Wilberforce?
The NDP is running a campaign. It's not running an analysis of the campaign necessarily. Some people, I guess the Press Progress has tried to do a little bit of this, but when you're running a campaign, you've got to focus on what you think is going to work, and focusing on the leader when he's not particularly popular is probably the best way to do it. Remember that everybody's got limited resources and limited times, and remember that for all the money we have here, this is still kind of a small place. And in some ways, I hate to say this, and this is like the embarrassing cousin comment. It can be taken the wrong way, but this is kind of an intellectual backwater. Not that there aren't smart people here, and not that there aren't good universities and so on, but in terms of advertising, for example, the state-of-the-art advertising work isn't being done in Alberta, and is never going to be done in Alberta, probably because of the meteorological climate we have, right? People who can command big salaries working in the advertising industry are going to live in places that are either more exciting like New York or have better climates like California. That's just the way it is, right? And so there's only so much you can do with the resources that you have.
We've talked about how this is a two-person race, and that is the reality of it. It's not really something that's being created. Do you think that Mr. Khan of the Liberals and Mr. Mandel of the Alberta Party really made any difference at all in the debate last night, or were they just merely side items?
I don't think that Mr. Khan, who is a very nice person and very bright man, but I don't think he made any difference at all. I mean, his party's now been fatally destroyed. The party's probably been destroyed by Raj Sherman's leadership. It has had a damaged brand for a long time, but in that damaged brand there was about 12% of the electorate that supported that damaged concept that a lot of Albertans didn't like. So they were able to go along for a lot of years on the basis of that core base Liberal vote. But I think that's gone now because the NDP's co-opted it to some degree. And I'm not talking about party loyalists. I'm talking about people who are just looking for the place to vote. So I think Mr. Khan had a desperately difficult task. There was no breakthrough there. I've been talking to people about this, and some of them liked him and some of them didn't so much, but most seem to have liked him and had a positive impression of him. But so what? Mandel's a little different. Mandel's an old, I want to say political hack, but that's not what I mean. An old skilled politician who's been around for a lot of years. Can be an epic fundraiser. He was a very successful mayor of Edmonton who was able to get reelected. He was a Tory cabinet minister. He was very engaging. And I actually thought his performance in the debate was the best of all the candidates. And he reminded me of the Sheriff of Mayberry or someone like that, right? He had a kind of full, which is completely at odds with his real personality, but that's another story. But anyway, he seemed folksy and kindly, and he was the only one who could turn away a harsh word without putting his dukes up, right? And just seemed to be able to shrug it off in a funny way. So I think that he might have moved the dial the tiniest bit for the Alberta Party, but they're really so low. They're still in single digits that in an election like this where people have strong feelings of dislike for the two principal leaders, people are going to make their choice either on the right or on the left, they're going to make their choice on the basis of who can I vote for to stop the candidate I don't like. I don't think that, Ms. Notley certainly has fans and people who love her. I don't think Mr. Kenney has many people like that, but there's lots of people also who really dislike Rachel and the NDP because of the policies they bring forward, and they're going to vote for Kenney rather than for Stephen Mandel. I wouldn't be surprised to see that of the fringe parties with seats in the legislature now, that would be the Liberals, the Alberta Party, and the Freedom Conservative Party, that none of them will elect candidates.
Interesting. Do you see another orange sweep in Edmonton this time?
I think so. Certainly, again, those same polling, that's been making people gloomy about the NDP prospects in Calgary. The rural areas are going to go UCP no matter what, but really, they're very strong here in Edmonton. And lately, I've personally been feeling a little more optimistic about the rural and suburban areas around Edmonton. I live in St. Albert, and St. Albert is a riding that votes reliably Conservative, no matter how bad the candidate is at the federal level, and but has hopped back and forth and elected a new Democrat before Marie Renault, and they've elected Liberals before. So there are people there who don't like Conservative government and don't like the Conservative Party in Alberta, whatever name it happens to be going under. So I'd felt for a while, the NDP is doomed here, but I don't feel that now. I think that what I'm hearing from people who've been out on the doorsteps and what I'm hearing from my neighbors and friends is that there's still lots of support for the NDP there. It'll be close, but we'll see.
So again, the battleground is Calgary.
The battleground is Calgary. Totally agree.
Mr. David Clemenhaga, thank you very much for your time with The View Up Here.
Okay.
That was a real amateur cut at the end of that interview. Sorry about that. Thank you to David. That was a fun conversation. We had a good time. Now, interview with Sandra Azokar, the Executive Director of Friends of Medicare. It's been around since 1979 to protect and enhance public delivery of health care. We got into a few different subjects. The View Up Here is quite pleased to have on Sandra Azokar, who is the Executive Director of Friends of Medicare. Welcome, Sandra. What is Friends of Medicare?
Well, thank you for having me. Friends of Medicare is actually an advocacy organization that has been since 1979, promoting the protection and expansion of our public health care system. So politically speaking, we have actually been quite busy in the last 4 decades at least, trying to prevent the privatization in various ways through various legislations that previous governments had tried to push through. But every time they were met with resistance, because Albertans know that public health care matters, that public health care is something that we need, and that it should be there for all based on need and not ability to pay. So that's what we do.
Well, the thing that really I like about that is you're quite willing to say that, yes, you are political advocates. And in this environment, especially with what we went through with the Harper administration, it scared some organizations off, but Friends of Medicare has always stayed there. Now, when we look at the Alberta election that's happening right now, I, for one, am surprised that healthcare is not being talked about an awful lot, which is a change from every other election here since the 80s. Is it being misdirected? Are the parties taking advantage of other hot-button topics to kind of minimize healthcare?
I think in a lot of ways this election has been different in that you're right. We have been focusing a lot on the economy and jobs and the pipelines. But a conversation that is certainly needed to be had is healthcare and the importance that it plays in terms of public services that need to be there whether or not the economy is doing well or not well. You know, people do not stop needing healthcare because the price of oil is down. So it's definitely something that needs to be planned long-term with a long-term vision and not basically guided by election cycles. So the political will always has to be there to ensure that Albertans receive the quality care that we expect and that we need.
It must be awfully frustrating to be involved so directly with this topic, and yet we see study after study, decade after decade, that pretty much proves that the questions of poverty, the questions of people being left behind, they're not really monetary problems, they're political decisions.
I think any time that you talk about a public service, they're definitely guided by ideology. I think a lot of parties use that word as if it was something bad. I think as a politician that you'd be naive not to understand that ideology is what guides sometimes the vision that people hold. Our advocacy comes from the lens of equality. We believe that everybody is equal and that we all deserve the same quality health care. If we can't be equal when we're sick, then when really can we be equal? And so that's what guides, that's the ideology that guides the work that we do. A lot of parties use it as a dirty word. The ideological stance or policies that are coming down from specific, it's only bad because you don't agree with that type of ideology. And I think that people need to understand that politics is what guides the decisions that are made on our behalf. And if we're not in the position of making sure that our voice is heard, that our values are being reflected in whatever policy or ideology is guiding our government, then we're missing out on a great opportunity to ensure that, again, that we guide the work that the government's doing based on exactly what we would like to see.
I think we're here at the Public Interest Alberta Conference, and everything we've heard over the last 2 days is people have to remember that the topics may be driven or attempted to be driven by the political parties, but their consent for those topics do come from the people. So the people still can force what is talked about. Of course, Friends of Medicare is not leaving healthcare off the agenda. What is Friends of Medicare doing this election specifically to make sure that healthcare remains in the picture?
You know, for us, we've actually been working on three main strategic areas that we have actually been trying to highlight, to bring attention to through either videos or having town hall meetings or sending as much information as we can to the social media world, and trying to have a conversation with Albertans and trying to get Albertans informed. One of the biggest areas that we've been working for a long time has been around the issue of seniors care. Seniors care in Alberta for the last 2 decades has been seriously privatized. Is one of the areas where we have seen the most aggressive privatization, where the care of our seniors went from providing health care to a hospitality industry and now to a real estate industry. And that the marketization that we have seen over the years has resulted in people constantly having to pay more out of pocket and receiving perhaps not the level of care that they need. And that's something that governments have had to, have kind of neglected in a lot of ways, because people that are vulnerable, that are trying to deal with their elderly parents, do not have sometimes the energy to kind of advocate for changes in the system. So what we would love to see in this election is actually parties talking about the need to establish a staff-to-patient ratio. You know, we have some facilities where at night we have one staff for 30 seniors, and these are not seniors that are necessarily sleeping all night. You know, so there has to be better regulations, better oversight in terms of how our seniors are getting care, and how the workers that are providing those cares are actually having to provide under what conditions the care is being provided. Care conditions are working conditions, and vice versa. And if we don't, deal with those two issues, then I think seniors will continue to receive less than quality care.
So, in fact, the issues really haven't changed over the last 30 years.
No, we have actually just seen, solutions that will deal with some areas but leave important ones out. We would love to see, the other area that we've been working on has been around the issue of privatization and private clinics, for example. You know, private clinics where we have people having to pay for memberships to belong to these executive and concierge clinics, and the privatization of diagnostic imaging, you know, where people who have the money can jump the queue. Basically, it's about queue jumping, which goes against, it's a slap in the face to the Canada Health Act. We have asked the government to look into that situation to see whether or not there has been a violation of the law of the land. We're still waiting for that outcome of audits. We want to be able to deal with that, and how that plays into impacting things like wait times, right? Because sometimes you cannot get to see a surgeon if you don't have your diagnostic imaging, your MRI, or your CT scan. But if you have to wait more than what you need to wait, then if I have the money and can jump the queue, I'm also in the queue faster in the surgery wait times. And those are the things that should not be allowed to happen. We need to have better control of where the bottlenecks are for the wait times that we're currently seeing in this province, and we need to have clarity as to how it is that we can best serve Albertans without having to move the goalpost to make it look better in terms of wait times, or getting rid of wait times, as a whole, as we heard exactly what is happening in the UK right now, where they got rid of all the wait times so that the government is no longer accountable for them. And then the third area that we've been working very diligent on has been on the issue of pharmacare, the issue of the fact that 1 in 5 households in Alberta are unable to afford medication. Friends of Medicare, along with our national allies, have been pushing the federal government very hard to finally implement a pharmacare program that we would like to see being discussed in the federal election coming up. But we're also looking for provincial take in a national pharmacare program. I think whatever party forms government after April the 16th, we're going to be expecting that they do have buy-in into a national pharmacare program.
Now, we have seen movement in Ottawa on pharmacare with the Trudeau government, the establishment of, a commission, I guess to call it, to look into it seriously, and it has been done. I know the final report is coming very shortly. Should be before the election, yes?
That's correct, yeah. It's actually an advisory council that was set up in the 2018 budget that is being currently led by Dr. Hoskin, who used to be the health minister for Ontario. We were quite encouraged by the fact that he was the one to lead this task force, and they actually been charged with the task of setting a blueprint for what a national pharmacare program will look like. The last couple of weeks or so, we saw an interim report that kind of set the groundwork for the start of a pharmacare program. But the question that they did not answer in that interim report is to whether or not it's going to be a national pharmacare or just a fill the gap, plan, which is something that we do not want, which is something that reports, all kinds of parliamentary reports, all kinds of academic reports, all kinds of research have already proven that what we need in order not only to save lives, but to save money is a national pharmacare program. So it would not be, I think that the Liberals have a real opportunity to leave a legacy. And what better legacy can you leave if you're the party that creates, or even for the other politicians, if you're in the parliament sitting where they pass a national pharmacare program, it's a historical legacy.
Well, the thing that interests me is most of these comparisons are done with the OECD countries. And of course, the United States is the outlier completely on healthcare. But as far as nations in the OECD that have universal single-payer healthcare, Canada is the only one that does not have a pharmacare program.
Yes, that's correct. And we also pay the highest amount of money for medications, even higher than the United States. So definitely it's not working. What we currently have is not working. We have a patchwork of drug plans in this country. We have over 110,000 private plans and over 70 public plans across the country. In Alberta alone, we have 23 plans that cover 900,000 people, 20% of the population. And when it comes to, and one of those plans is the seniors plan, the seniors benefit. But they also have a co-payment of $25 for each of the drugs that they need. So if you're on a fixed income as a senior, that adds up really quickly if you're taking more than one medication. And we know that for a fact that always impacts seniors in terms of women specifically who didn't have a job when they were working age and now are living on a very small amount from CPP and all the other benefits that you can apply for. So it is an issue that definitely is a way of reducing poverty that you mentioned, is a way of ensuring that people do not have to make the choice between buying groceries or getting their medication. It would save the healthcare system billions of dollars just in heart disease and preventable heart disease that could have. We're seeing over $93 billion in unnecessary hospitalizations around that issue. So it doesn't make sense for us not to have, it doesn't make economic sense for us not to have a national pharmacare plan in place.
Well, I know that every time this issue comes up for a actually collaborative survey among the public, it doesn't matter where you take it, it doesn't matter what flavor of government is in seat where the survey is taken. Canadians overwhelmingly support this. Now, it does make sense to me that you would throw the suggestion out there that this is a legacy, this is a historic project that's there. And studies prove that the money is there. If we have $4.5 billion for a piece of paper that says we can build a pipeline, never mind the cost of it, I would think we would have the money for this. Now, do you think that this fill in the gap thing, like when you mentioned the tens of thousands of private plans that are out there, the fill in the gaps option would be to try and find the people that are missing and we're going to cover just them?
Yeah, it's about 10% of the people that currently don't have any type of coverage. So I think the insurance companies are target. The insurance company and pharmaceutical companies, who are also one of the groups that do not support a national pharmacare, go figure, would want just to see that, because they believe that the plans that we currently have in place work and that they exist and that there's no need for us to be looking at anything else. But again, when you have a work plan, for example, if you're fortunate enough to have employment that includes a work plan, those work plans, you can't rely on them. You could lose your job tomorrow and not have a plan. Or you could get a divorce from the person that has a plan, or separation from the person that has a plan. And you also have to remember that employees actually sometimes pay extra for this plan when they lose wages, because sometimes when you're bargaining for wages, you'll take lower wages but a better benefit package. So we know that work plans don't work. So insurance companies would love to see the federal government just have that fill the gap. They did that in Quebec. In Quebec was the first one that adopted that model in 1997 to fill the gap, and the drug costs are the highest because it doesn't work, and it's already been tested, right? So 12%, currently about 12% of Quebecers can't afford their drugs because it only deals with that amount of people that are already somewhat covered under public plans, right? And what we want is a universal system, one that would give us the ability to bargain better drug prices as a country as a whole. Right now, drug prices are bargained by each individual province in secrecy because you cannot tell one province what you got as a deal for the specific drug. And so that's why we see such an inequality in drug coverage across the country. An out-of-hospital cancer treatment drug that is completely covered in Alberta that costs $20,000 for each treatment cycle is not covered at all in PEI. So people in PEI would have to come up with the $20,000 to get that. And Canada is one country. Yeah. And the reason why we have the Canada Health Act is so that we can have that portability of healthcare system. We see a lot of people having to move from one province to the other because the drug that they need is not covered in their province of origin. As Canadians, that should be unacceptable.
Well, I mean, especially you mentioned the Canada Health Act, and that is, as far as I've ever seen any federal politician argue on behalf of the Canada Health Act, portability and universality is what it's all about. But yet, maybe the OECD's on to something. That's why they do it, and we should.
Yeah. Overall, like if your perspective is just to save money, households in Canada, the parliamentary budget officer figured that households would save about $7 billion every year if we had a national drug plan. Employers would save over $9 billion as well. So the savings are there. But for us, it's it shouldn't be as to how much money we're going to save. The question should be, how many people are we going to help? And that should be the focus in this conversation, right? And so that's what we've been pushing for, and that's one of the biggest areas of advocacy that we're currently engaged in, both at the provincial level and at the federal level.
Well, it makes sense to me, because it does appear to me that there is a window opening. Just even with the announcement in the federal budget 2018, to the establishment of the panel, to the interim report, it's not being stonewalled. It's being let process, and they're moving on it. So it only makes sense to try and keep it in the public consciousness. Now, when we go back to what's happening in Alberta, I know the Friends of Medicare has sent a list of questions to the parties. How's the feedback from the different parties? Yeah,
and the questions that we did ask, just so that your audience knows, is actually around the three strategic areas that I've talked about, where they stand on privatization of seniors' care, where they stand on investment into health care, sustainable investment. We've asked them about pharmacare. We've received lovely answers from the Green Party, and is the only party that actually has allowed their candidates to answer by themselves. So it varies depending on what their knowledge of the subject area is or is not. And then we received answers from the NDP, one blanket answer for all their candidates. And we haven't received anything from the Alberta Party. We have received only one answer from the UCP or a candidate's agent, who basically said that they were too busy and we needed to contact them after April the 16th.
We'll just defer that until the votes are counted.
Yeah.
Well, that seems rather simplistic. I know also, this interview we're recording will air on April 10th. And I know April 10th is also the day of another activity of the Friends of Medicare. What's happening on April 10th?
On April the 10th, we're actually having a Twitter campaign where we ask people just to take a picture with a sign that we have available on our website. And just to remind people out there through social media that healthcare matters, that it's important for you to vote, to reflect your values when it comes to what you believe our healthcare system should be and what it should look like. And I encourage people to do their homework. On our website, we have a list of all the promises that have been made so far. We always get accused of trying to maintain the status quo and not look at any kind of different changes. And I think that's really far from the truth. What we're trying to do is actually to improve our healthcare system, to look for accountability, to look for transparency around where the money that we currently have, the large amount of money that we currently have in the system, is actually being allocated. We want the government to look at the areas that are most heavily privatized, like home care. Home care is an integral part of our healthcare system, yet it has, over the years, it has been privatized by stealth. People don't even know where the services are coming from. Well, I can let you know that they're coming from private companies that are owned by corporations in Ontario. Again, seniors care, which is another area of privatization, we need to know exactly where our money is going, and we need to know now so that when we talk about what changes need to be made, then the answers are there, and there's nothing hidden from us. And governance is a huge issue in our healthcare system. It's not about how much money we spend on administration or not. It's about how it is that the delivery is actually overseen, and what some of the decisions that are being made how they impact directly the frontline delivery. And it would be really good for governments just to sit down with frontline workers and listen to them and hear from them firsthand as to what areas need to be fixed. Don't talk to the policymakers who've never worked in a hospital floor. Definitely, don't make decisions that will impact the health of people if you don't know what the unintended consequences will be. And I think overall, our success of our healthcare is because of the frontline workers, because of the care that they put into doing their job well. We need to reinforce that, and we need to support that. We need to fund that appropriately with sustainable funding, and a huge issue. That's what we're asking people to do, to make sure that that's how they vote. Not telling anybody how to vote. We're just letting them know that they need to do their research.
I totally agree that it needs to remain on Alberta voters' minds, because healthcare is one of the government services that are involved in every citizen's birth. It's in their lives for their entire life.
From birth to
very few services have that kind of reach and need. It's good to know that you guys are campaigning so actively, even though that it seems to have slipped off the radar for this election. What is the web address for the site?
Is www.friendsofmedicare.ca, and we have a little tab that says Election 2019, and you'll find all the information there. We also, along with Public Interest Alberta, produce some videos that actually talk about some of the issues in seniors' care. Share those with your friends and get people to talk about it. It's important that we actually have a conversation about the areas that we need solutions in, where political parties need to actually be addressed, and not just superficial solutions. We need to know exactly how that's going to play down the road. Like I said, any healthcare promise or any healthcare policy decision has long-term ramifications, and they need to be looked at as such. And so we need to ensure that when we make decisions on April 16, that we have all the information available to us. Ask your candidates. Maybe they'll have better luck in getting through to some political parties, but make sure that you vote, and that you vote in an informed way.
Alrighty, well, thank you very much for your time, Sandra Azikar, Friends of Medicare. We'll see what happens on April 16th.
Thank you for having me.
Alrighty, there we go. Thank you to Sandra. Again, fun interview and an important topic. Now, that's it. All I'm going to say is I could care less who you want to vote for. Just vote. Validate the system. That's all I ask. Next week, we will, look at the results, which will be the day after the election. There's also another election in Canada this month, Prince Edward Island. Take a look at that. Next week's show will be the finale of Season 10. And then there will likely be a couple weeks off. But then, we'll be back. The 6th year of the View Up Here will start with Season 11. Probably in early May. I wish I would have had my shit together better to do some more coverage of the Alberta election, but I did what I could. Thank you to David Clement-Haga. Thank you to Sandra Azikar. Thank you to the listeners. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Good night.